Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Seat Open Poker Podcast. I am your host, Bart Hanson, and today's episode for November the 20th, 2012 is Depolarization. As always, you can email the show at bart@seatopenpoker.net. That's bart@seatopenpoker.net. You can also check out the forums over at the homepage, seatopenpoker.net/forums. We've got some good strategy discussion going on over there. Feel free to post some hands. I try to respond to everyone. Sometimes 2+2 can be a little bit intimidating. It's somewhat of I would say, a trolly environment. And even sometimes I look at it and I just, a lot of this stuff is just useless over there in the sense of actually trying to get some real strategy. So, if we could actually have a real strategy, if we could build this forum and build this forum community up to actually have real strategy discussion, I think it would be a really, really good thing. There's almost 300 members already, which is nice. That's running at about maybe 60% of what I had at the end of Deuce Plays Premium. And I'm pretty happy with the numbers, and that's kind of what I expected. As people will continue to to come over. Currently, one other quick thing too about the forums. I actually got an email from a subscriber today that asked about changing their username, because by default, when you sign up, and I'm sure some of you have noticed this, that your username is your name to post in the forums. And the way that you can change that is you can click on forums and you can click on profile, and then you can click on edit name. And I'm just going to double check that real quick, as I'm pretty sure that is exactly the process. But yeah, you click on forums and you go to edit name. And you can change, you can change your username to whatever you want it to be. So you can check that out if you do want to choose your name, if you do want to change your username. It's pretty easy to do. So, as far as other news with the site, I know I sent out a blast email, and I want to give you guys the most up-to-date information on the RSS feed. The RSS feed, of course, would allow you to basically put in some information into into your iTunes, and then have the premium podcast basically come through your iTunes automatically every week. For those of you that were members of Deuce Plays Premium, they did it basically. They did it based on an authentication system where you had to log in and put your password into iTunes. I know last week I said that I had estimated that the build out process would be like about 1 to 2 weeks. Unfortunately, the subscription management program that I'm using for the Seat Open website, in their functionality, there was supposed to be the ability to have secure RSS feeds. This was supposed to be an automatic, or it was supposed to be an easy implementation where everybody would get their own address, their own RSS feed. You plug it into iTunes, and away we go. You sign up, you get generated your unique address, and there it is. That functionality doesn't work. They put it into their product, and it just doesn't work. It never has worked. So all I can tell you guys is I can't give you a time frame. I'm telling you that I'm having my web developer. It's the number one priority that we're working on right now. We're working on that, and we're working on moving Crush Live Poker over. Now, with the Crush Live Poker, optimistically, I hope to have it over by the beginning of the calendar year, which would be like another, 4, 5, 6 weeks, something like that. That in itself, I think, will be a pretty seamless process. I mean, there might be some hiccups and stuff, and then I will, at that time, I'll be offering some sort of dual subscription. I got to figure out like the timing, because I know some of you guys, you've paid the $9.99 for 1 month, and then CLP comes in, and how do we deal with doing that dual if you guys, if you started like on the 5th of the month, and we start offering it on the 15th or the 20th. I got to figure something out with that. I'll just try to make it as fair as possible, whether that's releasing some free content or whatever. But as far as the RSS feeds, all I can tell you is that like literally um, the web company that I hired to build the site, and I'm pretty happy with the site. They're working on it basically full time. Looking for a solution. In the meantime, again, if you want to listen to the mobile on your mobile phone, you can download or you can go to your App Store, iTunes, excuse me, or if you have an iPhone, you can just go to the App Store and just search on a downloading program. There's a bunch of them that are free. Just pick up a free downloading application. Um, and what you can do then from that downloading application is go to the podcast link, log in through the browser of the premium of the download application, click on the premium link and click on download. With the Droid, you can just actually hold down the link, I believe, with your thumb, um, and download the content to your phone. Don't play it through the native player. Of course, if you download it to your computer, it's super easy because then you can import it into iTunes, um, and you can sync it to your phone. And that's really simple. Download the files to your desktop, go over to your iTunes, go to add file to library. If you want to have it so that it's categorized as a podcast, you can right click on the file, click on info, and change the audio property to podcast. And I actually got a couple emails last week saying that if you're in the cloud and you do that, the podcast will actually automatically sync to your phone wirelessly. I'm not going to go too much into detail on that, but there is that. Again, not to get super technical, but you can do that. So that's kind of where we stand. I'm off to Macau on Wednesday. I'm going to be in China for 2 weeks. I'm going to be doing a podcast over in China. I've got a buddy of mine that's probably going to be playing in some relatively high stakes games. I'm not really playing all that much. I'm actually going over there to give a lesson to one of the high stakes Chinese guys. I got a pretty nice deal from a referral, and I'm going over there to give a lesson. And again, if any of you guys want private lessons, you can always contact me. I seem to be doing more and more of them. I really enjoy them, and it's basically just like 1 hour kind of phone calls or Skype lessons. Or if you want to do an assessment, you can come and play on live on the bike. Or if you're in the LA area, I kind of offer a package where I can sit behind you. And again, you can just contact me, Bart at seedopenpoker.net, or just click on contact us over at the at the webpage, and I'll talk to you about privately about rates. So the title of this podcast is Depolarization, and the reason why I made this episode Depolarization is if you've been following my Twitter feed, and of course you can follow my Twitter at Bart Hanson, as I put out daily strategy tweets every week. I was in the main event of the $1,600, I think they call it LA Poker Open tournament, and I've talked about this many, many times, where I say that the absolute best value tournaments really that I've seen around. Now I haven't played in like circuit events and Council Bluffs, Iowa, or the Heartland Poker Tour, but from what I've seen, and this is even better than the World Series of Poker in terms of the soft. Well, I guess the structure is better, so it's a little bit different than a 1500 at the World Series of Poker, which is kind of like a turbo, like a massive turbo. But these 1500 and these $1,600 and $2,000 tournaments that are at the end of these commerce like tournament series, like the California State Poker Championship, the LA Poker Open. I think Heavenly Hold'em is another one. They're just unbelievable value. So this was a $1,600 re-entry. They got like 364 entries. First prize was 125,000. I finished 13th. I grinded a pretty good short stack. I had a pretty good short stack game, grinded it down, and unfortunately just got into a flip that I lost, which really sucks because with tournaments, I probably dropped about $15,000 or $20,000 in equity by losing that flip. I mean, you never really know, but the next pay scale, like I ended up cashing out for 72. The next pay scale at 12th was 87, and at ninth was 12,000. And if I win the double through, I basically have average chips with 13 people left, and I'm not going to do anything stupid. So you can see in sixth place is like 40,000 or something, or 30,000. So it just sucks. Like it's a lot of equity lost, or it's a lot of real money value lost when when you lose those flips. But when you're playing in no limit tournaments, you have to, um, you know, it's what it's all about. I mean, you just got to get yourself into a position to get lucky. But the reason why I that got me thinking of depolarization is because, man, I would tell you in tournaments, we talk about people's like river betting frequencies being polarized at the mid stakes levels of no limit cash games. In tournaments, it's even much, much, much more so. It's much more pronounced. Um, and occasionally somebody will bet two streets with top pair, but the pot control is just so over rampant in those things. I mean, when people are bringing it in for a min raise, which is a lot of times the younger players will do. Some of the older players are still doing like 2.5 to 3x. I mean, you get such a good price in the blind, like 6 or 7 to 1 immediately, especially if somebody else comes in. And you can literally take off the flop pretty light because people just check it through so much on the turn. It's amazing to me. Um, and the bluffing frequency isn't really there all that much, like when I've ever seen like a check raise on the turn, which is, I always wonder why people are checking through, checking through, checking through, but it's like you almost see a free card all the time. And there's a little bit to that as well at the $5 blind level in cash games, and that's the latest tweet that I put out. It's like, if you notice people, they give so many ridiculous free cards. I'll see a guy like with Ace King even, raise it pre-flop, get two callers, the board will come out King 9 deuce, he'll bet, and two people will call, and now the turn's a jack, and it'll get checked to him, and he'll just check it through. And it just doesn't. It's so ridiculous to not have the confidence within your game. And I don't mean personally ridiculous, but you need to have the confidence in your game to be able to bet fold in these spots. Why are you checking back ace king on a king 9 deuce turn as a jack, rainbow board when the turn check raise bluffing frequency is just not there? You're just losing value and giving free cards. I mean, you can bet that, and somebody check raises you, you can easily fold, easily fold. And it doesn't matter. I mean, especially if you're gonna call the river off. Like, why are you scared of checking back the turn because you think that somebody hit a gut shot or hit king jack or hit jack 9 if you're gonna pay the river off? I mean, the only reason why I would think that you might make the case for checking back the turn against passive players is if you're going to fold the river. If you're confident that you're now beat. Now, in theory, the whole thing goes about checking back the turn in that spot is because you don't want to get semi-bluffed off of your hand. That you're pot controlling in a spot where you're checking it back and you're going to basically call any river because you don't want to open up the betting basically on the turn to get blown off of your hand. I mean the whole concept of I don't really even know off the top of my head if someone were to say, "Hey, what's a good no limit cash game book?" I guess the Ed Miller book that introduced the SPR, like no limit theory in practice, is pretty decent, although that's almost like 5 years old. But in a lot of these books about no limit, they always talk about, well, the bigger the pot gets, the more one pair hands go down in value. And I think I tend to disagree with that the more and more I think about it. I mean, on the surface, it sounds like it's a pretty accurate thing where it's like, well, if you start getting into 2, 3, 400 big blind pots, chances are that one pair might not be good. To simplify it, and that's a pretty general statement, but you can't say that you're not going to bet the turn with aces on a king nine or ace king on a king nine deuce jack board, because now that you've bet and you've gotten called by two people on the flop. Let's say that let's do this in blinds, right? So let's say that we raise over the top of two limpers to 5 blinds, and the limpers call. So there's 15 in there, and then we bet 10 on the flop, king nine deuce, and they both call. So now it's 45, right? And then we start to say, well, now the turn's a jack, and if we bet 30 here and one guy calls, now all of a sudden, the pot's over 100 big blinds. And I don't want to play in a pot where that I'm comfortable getting it in, with one pair here with 100 big blinds. You know what I mean? What I mean is that the whole, if you look at that whole statement of the bigger the size of the pot, the more that one pair of one pair of hands go down in value. I mean, it always is going to depend on the situation. I mean, I've won 250 big blind pots in single raise pots with a pair. I've won. I did a hand back in the free days of Deuce Plays Deuce Plays the podcast, where I won like a 140 big blind pot in a single raised pot with king jack when the top pair on the board was a jack. It all depends. So the point that I'm making is that you just can't give out free cards on the turn. And it's even more of a situation where when you're betting against multiple opponents and a guy check raises you, I think it tends to lend to their bluffing frequency to be even lower, because you look stronger when you bet into two people. So the fact that you're betting again into two people, king nine deuce turns a jack, and you've got ace king or aces, the fact that you bet again into two people, I truly believe, again, in my experience, and this actually goes to the depolarization discussion that we're going to have here in a second. I truly believe that in my experience, that opponents are less likely to make a play on you as a bluff because they think that you are going to be strong, and not only that, that subconsciously, and most importantly, that they don't think that strong opponents or people who appear to be strong will fold. And what I mean by that in a simple way is that subconsciously, I don't think that they're going to make a move on someone that appears to have a hand, because at this level, so few people are capable of folding. Now, that's not always the case. And again, I always battle this with myself, and people say, hey, Bart, you give your opponents too much credit. And it's not that I'm giving them credit, it's just something that I pick up on. Just like when I talk about how you can bet super thin on rivers, like with one pair with 4-liner to straights, because your opponents subconsciously think that you are polarized, even though they don't even know what polarized means, but they subconsciously think that if you're betting in this spot, you either have like the straight on a 4-liner or you have a bluff. And the reason they think that, and most importantly, is because everybody else in the player pool, or like 99% of the player pool, will have a bluff or the nuts in that spot. So they're not putting it all together and being like, oh, this is polarized. It's, I know that everybody else here wouldn't bet anything but a straight. So if they don't have the straight, then they're bluffing. So then they're just like, well, do you have the straight or not? And that's why you can make those thin bets. And this is what leads us into the discussion of depolarization, because if you can depolarize especially your river value bet range, it makes if you can depolarize your bets at the end in situations where people are normally polarized, you are going to be that much of a better player. And obviously, I've always talked about betting thin, but I'll give you an example of a hand that I saw in a cash game. And this actually involved the The same guy that I was talking about last week when I said I took the check call like value own line with the 9-10 of clubs. It got limped around, I think, in 3 or 4 spots. In the big blind, who's a laggy but good like winning reg, raised it up out of the big blind, and UTG called him, and another guy called behind. So already we're dealing with like pretty bloated pot up. It's like 500 and 10-20. It went limp. Guy made it like 160. It got limped around like 5 ways. Big blind made it like 160. It goes call. So the pot's about $500. Again, an under the gun limp and a guy in the middle called the over limp, and the other guy's folded. So it's three-handed, about a $500 pot. The board comes out ace, 5 deuce with 2 diamonds. The pre-flop raiser checks. Again, this kind of laggy, pretty good winning player. Pre-flop raiser checks. The under the gun limper bets out $275. The guy folds behind him, and the pre-flop raiser thinks about it and calls. Okay. So now the pot is 1050. Ace 5 deuce 2 diamonds. Ace 5 deuce 2 diamonds. Turn is a 10. Yep, the turn is a 10. Excuse me, it was ace 5 6 2 diamonds. I'm sorry. Ace 5 6 2 diamonds. Turn is a 10. Again, the pot is like 1050. Guy in the blind checks, and the under the gun now checks it back. Now, if you start to think about like the way this hand is playing out, I was watching this hand pretty closely. If I put myself on the guy's spot, who's the good kind of winning reg, if he has a reasonable raising range, right, out of the big blind, meaning like he's not raising like a whole bunch of garbage. He probably, when he raises out of the big blind, has a hand like maybe 7s or 8s plus, and especially with 5 people limping, I don't even necessarily know if he would raise with like 7s or 8s, but maybe he's got like 9s or 10s plus, right? And maybe like ace jack suited plus. Those are the hands. Maybe king queen suited. Something like that, right? So when the board comes out ace 5 6 with 2 diamonds, when there's 3 people or 2 other people in the pot, I would think that he's betting out with most of his aces if he hits his ace. So when he checks and then check calls, I'm like, well, I think there's a very good chance that he's got like a hand like jacks, queens, kings, whatever. I guess there's a possibility he could be playing it a little bit differently, and he could have like an ace queen or an ace king. But I just think that he bets out, especially against these opponents who there weren't any type of tricky. They were kind of straightforward types of opponents. So he check calls the under the gun's bet. The turn is a 10, and it goes check. And I'm starting to think, well, what does the under the gun have here? Like he bet the flop after the pre-flop raiser checked, and now he's checking back the turn. Now a lot of guys will do that with, he could have the front door diamond draw. He could have an ace and he's pot controlling it. Like he could have like, ace deuce suited, bet the flop, and now he's going to check it back, on the turn. And sometimes that's not a terrible play actually to make, because when you get yourself in this particular situation where, especially in this case where you think there's a really good chance that the pre-flop raiser would bet with an ace here. And we can definitely narrow the ranges of this hand down because there's this good player that's raising out of the blind, right? It's different from just a regular single raise pot from the field. He's raising out of the blind against 5 people. So if I'm in the under the gun spot, and for some reason I had limped in, say, with ace deuce suited and called his raise, and the pre-flop raiser checked, I might bet. Gets folded back to the pre-flop raiser, and he calls. Well, now the turn is an offsuit 10, and now he checks again. Now, if I think that there's a very big portion of his range are pocket pairs below an ace, sometimes, you might check back the turn there, hope that the front door flush doesn't come in, and try to like get value at the end, right? You try to get value at the end. You try to think that the pre-flop raiser might call you down because he thinks you busted out on some sort of draw. You don't want kings or queens to fold. It's a perfectly reasonable line to take against the pre-flop raiser when he check calls the flop with this type of action. So that's kind of what's going through my head here. Ace, 5, 6, 10, right? Check, check. Well, the river is the deuce of diamonds. So it brings in the front door flush draw. And obviously 3-4 gets here, but this guy's not playing 3-4 under the gun. So it brings in the obvious front door flush draw, and the guy in the blind checks. Now remember, the pot's 1,050, and this is what we're talking about with the depolarization of river betting, because we're going to go through a couple of different scenarios. We're going to look at it and say it was like an offsuit deuce as well, but it's a diamond. So the dude checks, and now the guy who checked behind on the turn, who's under the gun, now bets out $1,200 at the end. So he bets over the size of the pot. Again, it went raise out of the blind, call, call, ace 5, 6, check under the gun bets, 275, fold, big blind calls, pot 1050, turns an offsuit 10, check, check. River completes the front door flush, completes the deuce of diamonds, check, 1,200 now. And the guy in the blind, again, who's this good winning red, tanks for a long time and finally calls. He calls. And the guy under the gun turns over ace 8 of spades, which is just an ace. Just an ace. And he was value betting, and I was really, really impressed by this. Like, I don't think he was turning his hand into a bluff. I think that he was value betting. And the reason why I thought that this was actually quite a genius play was I think that the guy that was in the blind, the good player, thought that this guy's river betting range was super, super polarized. Super polarized to a hand that's like, the nut flush, or he busted out on some sort of draw, and he was trying to represent it. I mean, that's a bet that is a flush or nothing. 99% of the time with that sizing, that's a flush or it's a busted straight draw. That's it. That's all it is. But because this guy bet here with ace 8, and when he checks back the turn, he kind of rightly puts his opponent on a hand like kings or queens. Again, the guy, he could have value known himself because the guy could have check called with ace queen on the flop and got, still checked the river when the diamond came. But because of that, because he thought that that's what the guy had, he actually made his bet look very, very polar. Now, a lot of times that's going to be a bad call anyways, because when somebody makes a bet like that, certain opponents are just always going to have it. It's not even a polarized range. It's going to be like a very, very nutty range. But if you're a player where you're capable of bluffing, and I didn't really know this player. I kind of knew him. He was kind of solid. But if you're capable of bluffing there, then sometimes you can actually get looked up. Now, the funny thing is that the reason why that depolarization of that with this sizing works is because the front door flush came in at the end. If the river was an offsuit deuce, and I'm a pretty big proponent of this when I talk about how I think people check call the river too much because they think that their opponents are going to bluff when in fact I don't think that they bluff enough, especially when it looks like you're going to call. So let's say that deuce is not, it doesn't bring in the diamonds, and the same action happens where it goes, check check on the turn, 1050, river's an offsuit deuce. The guy from the blind checks again. So now the guy from the blind, when he checks again, like I think he absolutely does not have an ace, especially if he's a good player. He literally has like nines through kings, whatever pairs he raises out of the blind. That's what his hand is almost all the time there, right? So if he checks and now the guy under the gun bets out 1,200, Guys at 10-20 will make that value bet with an ace. If they bet the flop with a weak ace and they checked back the turn, and now the preflop raiser out of the blind checks the river, there are a certain amount, not a ton, but there are a certain amount of players that will value bet, and they'll value bet big, making it look like they missed the front door flush draw. And I don't think that if the guy bets 1200 when the flush card misses, that he gets paid off. Because I think because his line doesn't make that much sense. And again, when you're dealing with two pretty decent players, I mean, if I was in the blind spot where I had check called the flop with kings, it went check check on the turn, and then the river bricked off, and I checked again. And this guy bets 1200. I don't think I would call. I think the guy's got a value hand there. Whether it would have been like running into two pair or just value betting an ace. However, funny enough though, because the front door flush comes in, and because no one would bet an ace like that now, because I think most players, when they're in the under the gun spot, even if they were thinking about their opponent's range and they thought, well, I think the guy probably has kings or queens there, I can't bet 1200 because the guy can't beat the flush now. So not only can he not beat an ace, but he can't beat a flush. So I'm going to bet smaller. And my point is with this entire podcast is that that's actually the wrong way to think about it. Because if you can actually make a bet that depolarizes your range where the other player thinks that you can never have just an ace there, that you only have the top portion of your range here in a bluff, and if you think that your opponent's a thinking player, you can get some sick value, in a hand like that, because you would never think that a guy would call down, especially, when the flush card comes in. I'm gonna move to a hand that I played in the tournament too. That again, kind of, I mean, it definitely exemplifies, especially if you're playing in no limit tournaments where, the average player can't even beat like a 1-2 no limit game. I mean, these concepts are just absolutely they're emphasized, more, just incredible amounts. I had so many guys that looked me up light when I made thin value bets. I actually value bet ace king high, which is something you don't normally do in a no limit game. Just real quick, there's a hand where, and it was actually against a good player too. I opened under the gun with ace king, and it got folded around to the big blind, and he called. And the board came out, I think it was 8-4 deuce. And this guy was a good player. It came out 8-4 deuce. He checked, and I checked it back. I think the turn was a 3. He checked, and I checked it back. And then the river was a 3. And he checked, and I bet ace king, because I thought when he checked all 3 streets there, he had some sort of hand that was, had some showdown value like an ace high hand. And I also thought that he would bet a pair at the end with that action. So I bet like 25% of the pot, and he called with ace queen. So I thought that was kind of cool. But so this hand goes down, and again, this has to do with river polarization. And this is kind of more of a simple, simple type of hand that I've definitely talked about in the past. So this lady that we're playing 400, 800 with a $100 ante. And I've got about, I think everyone has at least 65 blinds, 70 blinds. We're sitting pretty deep. This lady opens up for a raise from under the gun, and I flat call with queens. And I've done, I do probably way more flat calling with jacks and queens in tournaments than some other people, because people just don't know how to play post flop. So they would want to end the hand. They don't want to get themselves in the difficult spots. And this guy behind me calls as well, and then another guy calls. So it goes 4 ways, and I was like, oh, this is gonna get tricky. And the pot was like 9,000, and the board comes out ace 10-5, ace 10-5 with a front door flush draw. I've got queens. The guy in the blind checks, the preflop raiser checks, I check, and the guy behind me checks. So it gets checked through. So I'm thinking, all right, well, there's a decent shot that I have the best hand here. I think one of the differences that you'll see between younger, quote unquote, non-recreational tournament players, even in live tournaments, versus the older recreational tournament players, is that the non-recreational players, even if they're not even that great, but let's just say they play a ton of tournaments, they're these pothead kids, whatever, that play all these live tournaments. They do a ton of pot control, and they do a ton of checking back, top pair, weakish types of kickers. So you might see a guy who's a young kid check like an ace 10 4 board with like ace 5 if he opened like ace 5 of hearts. But you would never see an older person check. You just don't see older people check top pair in a tournament because they're way too scared of getting a bad beat and protecting. But with younger guys, it's definitely possible, especially if you're heads up. I mean, I actually flopped a set of jacks on a guy on a jack 7-4 board, and he was the pre-flop raiser. And he checked back the flop with ace jack on a jack 7-4 board after being like the under the gun pre-flop raiser, and I was in the blind. I mean, I ended up getting two big streets on the turn and on the river, but you can see where I'm going. Whereas an older player would never do that. So the flop is ace 10-4, gets checked through. The turn is a jack, and it brings a backdoor flush draw. So it's ace 10-4 jack. Guy in the blind checks. The lady bets out 2,500 now. And I actually think that on this street, I made a mistake. I ended up calling, and I look back at this hand, and in retrospect, if you do some like hand reading, I think this was a really bad call. Remember, it got checked through, and again, let's dismiss the fact that she's ever checking a single paired ace on the flop. The board is ace 10-4. Yeah, she could be slow playing like a set of aces, a set of tens. It's probably unlikely because of the two flush and there's four-way action, but it's possible. But now that the turn is a jack, okay, so I don't beat pocket aces, right? I don't beat pocket tens. Now the turn's a jack, I don't beat pocket jacks. I also don't beat king queen. Now I do have two queens in my hand, and I don't beat pocket kings. Now again, I'm not necessarily saying that she would bet pocket kings, but it's a possibility after the flop that she now might bet pocket kings after it got checked back, and now the turn is a jack. So in reality, even though she's only betting 2,500 into 9,000 on an ace 10-4 board, turns a jack, I really shouldn't be able to beat any type of reasonable betting range here on the turn. And in retrospect, I think it was a pretty pathetic call that I made on the turn with queens. There's just nothing that I beat here. Anyway, so I make the call, and this guy behind me, who was kind of a pitifully bad player, not so much in a spewy way, but he was the guy that I was just absolutely value betting to death the entire day, just because he kept looking me up with some ridiculous hands because I was value betting thin. He overcalls. So it goes 25 call, guy in the blind folds. So now the pot's 16-5. The river is like a brick. It's like an offsuit deuce. So it's total brick. And now the lady checks. Again, the pot is about 16,000. I check because obviously like I'm trying to get to showdown with it. I mean, it's a little bit different than in a cash game. Tournaments are different. You can't make as thin value bets when the pots get really big because, if you put in a half pot size bet and you're wrong, that could be, that the money lost in tournaments is actually worth more than the money won. So even though you should be making value bets and trying to pick up as many chips as possible, sometimes you can't value bet as thin as you can in a cash game because of that factor that if you lose the chips, it's more significant than winning extra chips. So I check, and now the guy bets out 12,500 here. 12,500. Obviously, if the lady calls, remember the turn brought two backdoor flush draws. Now, obviously, if the lady calls, then it's an easy fold for me. But she doesn't think too long, and she folds. And it gets back to me, and I'm like, all right, the board is ace 10-4, turn is a jack, river's a deuce. And I was like, his bet was extremely polarized, I thought. Like, he is never betting an ace here. And it's polarized to the point where the bet is so large, I think, in the sense that it's so large for a tournament that he might not even have two pair here. I mean, this guy was so bad that he could have had like Jack Deuce or some sort of weird two pair that had a flush draw on the turn, like a pair and a flush draw on the turn that ran into two pair on the river, like 10 Deuce or Jack Deuce. I guess he also could have had like 5-3 with some sort of flush draw on the turn, which runs into a wheel. I was most concerned with 5-3. Um, I was most concerned with 5-3 suited. But obviously, I saw that, you know, I saw that the, that a lot of the draws missed, that the flush draws missed. And so I said to him, I'm like, wow, man, this is like a PLO hand, right? I'm like, I've got two blockers in my hand with the queens. And I finally made the call. And he's like, oh, you got it. I just have a jack. Jack is such a weird bet. So obviously I was good with queens. It's one of the things too when you're playing these tournaments that these guys just have absolutely no idea sometimes why they are making the plays that they are. Like why you would try to bet a jack there at the. I mean the board is ace 10 4 jack deuce and it gets checked to you on the river. Why would you try to bet a jack there? Are you trying to get someone to fold an ace? Like someone's not going to fold an ace. I can understand trying to take a stab at the pot with no pair because you can't you think you can maybe bluff somebody off of second pair. You can't let king high win at showdown. But when you've got a jack, that's got really, really strong showdown value. I just don't understand the play. So anyways, I was good. It just would have sucked like if I had king 10, right? Say it got checked through on the turn, I had king 10, I picked up a flush draw. Now I got a pair and a flush draw and a gut shot. I call the turn. And on the river, it gets checked through this guy and he bets. I mean, king 10, I'm making the same call there, right? With king 10 if I'm making it with queens. And he turns over he's like, oh, I have a jack. Those are the things that make you absolutely, pull your hair out. Now, that particular example, I can call because I know that the player is bad enough that he's never capable of value betting a weak ace. I also know it's very unlikely that I think that he checks through. Bad players just don't really check top pair weak kicker all that much. Because remember, he was last to act. So I knew he was bad enough not to make, a thin value bet. So his range there is very polarized. Now, when you're playing against good players that are capable of betting top pair when the draws break out, their range is not very polarized. But again, to take it to the next level, to even further depolarize your range, you bet single pairs when the draw comes in when it's checked to you, like that example that I gave in the beginning of the show. I mean, you can become a monster if you can really, expertly depolarize, your range in that particular spot. One other quick little hand here, too, that I'll get to. And I think I'm going to read one or two emails, depending on the time that I have available here. This was a quick little hand in 1020 where I actually was playing during dinner break. I think it was on day one. We had an hour dinner break, and I just went down to get some food. So I was playing 1020, and this hand came up where it got limped around like 5 or 6 ways, and I was in the small blind with 8-4 suited, and I completed the extra chip, and the big blind checked. So, the pot was like $120. I have 8-4 clubs. The board comes out ace, king, 5 rainbow. Gets checked through. The turn is a 7. Ace, king, 5, 7. Gets checked through again. The river is a 6. So it's ace, king, 5, 7, 6. I have 8-4. So I have the second nuts. So I lead out here for... I just think in this spot, I thought it was a good spot for me just to bet out close to pot. I think that this is actually a skill that can be learned here too. Thought it was a good spot for me to bet out close to pot. I think I bet out 90, But I think some people make a mistake here when we're trying to figure out how to extract value. Yes, I have the second nuts. It would be the same thing if I had the nuts. I'm trying to figure out an amount that someone's going to call me with. When it gets checked through twice, it's probably unlikely that somebody has an ace. So I almost think that it's a spot where if somebody runs into two pair, sometimes they're not even going to raise you on the river. Or if they do raise you on the river, any type of good player is not going to call a bet three bet with bottom two or something like that. And somebody might hero look you up, like it might look like that you're trying to steal the pot. And again, a lot of people in my spot, even though I would do it, wouldn't bet a single ace. So somebody might think that you're bluffing, and they might think that you've got a strong hand. So, anyways, I bet out 90. Fold, and I've got 3,000 in front of me, and this other guy's got like maybe 2,200 in front of him. So I bet out 90, and now this guy raises to 220, and it gets folded back around to me. What is my play here? What do you think the right play is? And, this is a spot where, again, I keep stressing, it's the same reason why guys go to showdown, right? This is an issue where I can call and go to showdown, which is the same reason why we see guys at 5-10 being showdown monkeys, where they don't bet thinly on the river. They just check it back because they don't want to open the they don't want to open the betting back up. So I think that even 9 times out of 10 here, when recreational players are in my spot with 8-4, they're just going to call. Because if they re-raise and then they get re-raised, they don't know what they're going to do. They're not capable of folding. Now, is it the most optimal play? No, I don't think it's the most optimal play. Now, obviously, in theory, you could say, well, if you bet 3-bet the river, you will never get called by any hand that's worse than 8-4. If that was the theory, if that was the actual, if that was actually accurate, then no, you shouldn't bet 3-bet 8-4. But I don't believe that to be accurate. I believe that somebody could have, say, river to set. Somebody could level themselves and call with two pair if I click it back. They could have had they could have a smaller straight. What's a smaller straight out there? They could have 3-4, something like that. They could have rivered aces up or kings up. I think that not re-raising here is a big mistake. So I bet out 90. He makes it 220, so he raised to 130 more. I make it 490. I make it 490, which I think is a pretty good sizing. Because I hope that two pair will hero call me and all those other types of hands. I'm not gonna obviously move in. That would be a mistake, probably, to move in to bet. Bet 90, guy have a 220, and then you just move in, where now you're putting yourself in a spot where you're probably almost only going to get called by 8-9. I make it 490, and guy thinks about it for a while, and he re-raises to 1150. And it comes back to me, and I fold, obviously. But that's kind of the same similar situation where, that is a great example of basically bet 3-bet folding for value. We've talked about bet folding. We talk about raise folding. This is even another level where we're re-raise folding. I talked about a big hand on Deuce Place Premium last year where I check raise folded an under full house on the river. Not on a double paired board or anything, but I kind of made a sneaky full. I was calling somebody light with pocket fives on the flop, and I made a sneaky full house on the river where a 5 hit, and I check raised the river when like a backdoor flush came in, and the guy who had bet over the pot when I checked to him on the river, when I check raised him, just moved in for like some ridiculous amount, and I folded But this is even almost more of an extreme example. I mean, it's not quite as large in terms of the money, but the bet raise 3-bet fold. And in this particular spot, this is an extreme example of you. It's basically impossible if you were in my opponent's position. It's impossible for you to depolarize the 4th bet, right? You cannot not be polarized on the 4th bet. There's just no way that anyone is 4-betting back for value with anything worse than 8-9. If he's doing it for value, remember, it's river play in a limped pot where no money has gone in the pot until the river. If he's doing it for value, it always has to be the nuts. Now, can he be bluffing? Yes, somebody can always be bluffing, right? They can always be bluffing. What's the frequency of him 4-bet bluffing a bet 3-bet? Probably 1 in a million. I mean, we can talk about how his 4th bet here on the river is polarized, but in reality, it's always the nuts. But the point that I'm making is that it still can only be the nuts for value or a bluff, even though the bluff is so lightly weighted. And that's just an example of when you get into these spots where you put in multiple bets, that, again, it's impossible for him to be depolarized in this particular spot with a bet 3-bet. So I hope that you guys kind of understand that. I know it can be somewhat of a complicated topic, but if you start to think about, hey, what's one of the ways that I can really improve my game? It's obviously making thin value bets, but also depolarizing your range in a spot where everyone else is extremely polarized. And again, when you're dealing with good players, some spots, not everyone's polarized. Like those examples where I gave where a guy bombs out an ace when the front door flush misses. That's not necessarily a polarizing spot with good players. Good players are capable of betting pairs for value. But when the scare card comes, are those good players capable of kind of merging that or depolarizing that bet so that they get looked up by an opponent that thinks, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, that their bet is polarized when in fact it's not? And that's really the key. So I'm going to get into an email here from, let's see here. I got emails, and if I don't get to some of these, or if I only get to one, I'll continue on. All right, let's do Dragon Ash here. Dragon Ash sent me an email at bart@seedopenpoker.net. He said, "Hey Bart, I love the show. I'm a reg at the game. I've got about $600, and I guess this is in a 1-2 game. Middle-aged white guy in a suit. Table is mostly full of unknowns. Middle-aged white guy in a suit, bought in for 300 and has slowly accumulated chips. Now has table covered. That's the hero, I guess. Excuse me. Middle-aged white guy in a suit. Okay, so I guess we're the hero with the middle-aged white guy in the suit. Villain 1 has about $140. Villain 2 has about $300. Table has been overall fairly straightforward. Hero is the table captain and has been winning a lot of small pots with pre-flop raises from late position and standard C-bets on the flop. Okay. Villain 1's in the hijack. Villain 2 is in the cutoff. Hero is on the button. Now remember, Villain 1's got 140, Villain 2's got 300. We have 600. We're on the button. This is 1-2. Hero has 6-7 of clubs. A few limps to Hero, who bumps it up to 14. And he puts in parentheses, bend my standard raise at the table. Entire table folds to Villain 1 and Villain 2, who both call. Before we even get in deeper into this hand, again, I hesitate to... Now, if there's only 2 people here that have limped in, and you think that there's a good chance that you might get one of them to fold, or these guys are really nitty. I don't mind the ISO here with 6-7 of clubs, but normally, especially at this low level, the lower the level, the less ISO raising I do, unless it's for pure value. And definitely with over like 3 limpers, I would really hesitate to start to really ISOing with like suited connectors from out back. Um, I just think it's burning through money. And you actually have to look at the rate considerations, whether it's worth it to over limp. If you're dealing with a pure rake, like it is in Vegas, where they're taking 10% up to a certain cap, or if you're dealing with a time collection, then I think that you can over limp like a hand like 7-6 of clubs over 2 people. Now, when you're dealing with like a California flat drop, then it's probably not going to be right to over limp here. Like even if you were playing, say, 2-5, 200 cap, where I think the rake is the same, it's $5 plus 1. You get 2 limpers in front. There's no way you can over limp here with 7-6 of clubs. But again, if you're playing a time collection game or a rake game, where they're not taking $5 until like 100, and you can over limp $2, where they're only taking $1 for every $10, then you can see the difference. It's almost 30 or 40%. So that's what I would say as a caveat here with this particular hand. So hero makes it 14. They both call. Okay, so now the pot is $42. The board comes out 8 of clubs. I guess the pot is $50. 14, $50. I guess there are a couple other people that limped in. He says the pot's $50. The board comes out 8 of clubs, 9 of clubs, deuce of hearts. We have 6-7 of clubs. Villain 1 shoves, open shoves for 120, saying, I'm on tilt, I'm all in. Villain 2 thinks about it, then calls. Now remember, Villain 2 starts the hand with 300. We have him covered. So now he's got like 170 left. Something like that. So the pot is 290. It's 120 for us to call. And there's this guy who's got 170 in the middle, who's called in front of the all-in. Or the guy moved all in and the guy called. So Sean says, what should we do here? Now, I think this is a very, very, part of the reason why I picked this hand is very interesting, because I think a lot of people would look at this and they'd be like, well, you have a open-ended straight flush draw. How could you possibly fold? Even besides the fact that the guy's got money in front, but even if we were to treat the guy in the middle all in, so maybe it went 120 and we just treat the guy like he's all in the middle because the money's going to go in anyways, which isn't necessarily the case because it could get checked down. But let's say that it went 120 and then 290 from the middle guy, so that'd be 410, 460. 460, 290 for us to call. Let's say that, again, if the middle guy had moved all in, where we would be getting like 1.5 to 1. We've got 15 outs, we've got straight flush outs. But of course, this is the situation that I always warn you guys about if you've listened to my material. You have to avoid getting into these spots where you are most likely up against a made hand and a dominating draw. And I've seen people make this mistake a ton, where they don't take into account the fact that their draw is dominated. And if their draw is dominated here, they are basically toast. Now, this hand is a little bit different because if you're up against, say, like 9-8, or let's say the guy from up front, he's got the nut flush draw. Like he shoves with like ace-4 clubs, okay? Board's 9-8 deuce, right? And let's say the guy in the middle calls with a set. Let's say he's got pocket deuces. So now we're up against a dominated draw. We're up against a dominated draw and a made hand. Because we have the straight outs and because we have the straight flush outs, we actually have 2 club outs, right, to make the nuts. And we've got 6 offsuit outs. So we could have 8 outs. Of course, the set could have redraws against us, but you can see, like, just best case scenario. best case scenario, we would need to get like 2-1. It's just not good enough. Um, where it really is very extreme is when we flop a pair and a flush draw. Let's say the board comes out, queen, 7, deuce, and we have 8-7 of clubs. And instead of ISOing with 6-7 of clubs, we've ISOed with 8-7 of clubs. And we get the same action. Queen, 7, deuce, 2 clubs. Guy from up front moves in, and guy in the middle calls. Now we really have 0% equity. I mean, the 6-7 of clubs is kind of unique because it's the straight flush draw, and against even the made hand, we have those straight outs. But now, in this particular case, with our pair and a flush draw, we have 0% equity, basically, against a big made hand and a dominating draw. Now, if the guy in the middle has like ace-queen, or some sort of random queen, and then we're up against a higher club draw from the guy from up front, we still have like 5 2-pair trip outs. But of course, all these guys have redraws too. I mean, the thing with the 6-7 of clubs, I'm saying we've got 8 outs, but the nut flush draws got these redraws too. You know what I mean? It would have to be a perfect world here. So that's the difference between having this particular straight, open-ended straight flush hand and quote unquote pair and a flush draw. But you've got to be, consciously aware of these spots that usually when a guy like open ships, from up front, that's usually more indicative of a draw. But when the guy in the middle calls, he's usually got a made hand. But it doesn't really matter the order. One of these guys has got a draw, and the other one's usually going to have a made hand. I mean, on a board run out like this, it's just that simple. And yeah, I mean, I think you got to make a disciplined fold. I mean, obviously you look at it and you're like, oh my god, I flopped the 15-out draw, and how often do I fold the 15-out draw? Well, you don't fold the 15-out draw usually heads up, but when there's another guy in there and someone's made an unbelievably aggressive action move and the other guy has called, then you're toast. You're done. So just be disciplined and get rid of it. That's going to wrap it up for us this week. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Depolarization. Again, try to get it into your game, and see you all next week.